Hello, friends. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Here, I share a brand new story every day. If you enjoy my videos, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was the spring of 2015, and for me, a senior in high school, life was mostly about the anticipation of prom. I had just turned 17, and while most of my classmates were focused on dresses, tuxedos, and dates, I was on a mission: make dinner reservations at a local Italian spot called Bellini's Bistro for me and my best friend, Lisa. I had never made a reservation before. My parents usually handled stuff like that, but I figured it was time I learned. Little did I know that simple task would turn into one of the strangest experiences of my life. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, phone in hand, nervously rehearsing what I was going to say. Finally, I mustered up the courage and dialed the number. After a few rings, I was greeted with the usual cheery customer service voice. "Thank you for calling Bellini's Bistro. How can I assist you today?" Hi. I'd like to make a dinner reservation for two," I said, my voice shaking slightly. There was a pause, then the host responded, "Please hold." Before I could say anything else, I was met with complete silence on the line. No music, no background chatter, just dead air. I held the phone to my ear, waiting for the typical Italian music to kick in. Instead, what I heard was far more unsettling. Suddenly, a sharp whistling sound filled the line, like wind rushing through a cracked window during a storm. The sound was faint at first, but quickly grew louder, almost deafening. I strained to listen, and that's when I noticed it. There were words hidden in the whistling, low and distorted. The more I listened, the more I felt like someone or something was trying to speak directly to me. At first, the words were jumbled and incoherent, but then clear as day I heard it. "You're the worst kind of cold." The voice was raspy and wheezing, like someone gasping for breath through clenched teeth. It reminded me of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, but with a more menacing edge. A chill ran down my spine, and I gripped the phone tighter, unable to move. The whistling intensified, and I could now make out more phrases buried beneath the eerie soundscape. "Do you feel it? Frozen inside, just like them." The words echoed in my mind, making my heart race. It felt as though the voice was speaking not just through the phone, but directly into my thoughts. The worst part, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was on the other end knew more about me than it should. Out of nowhere, the whistling stopped, and the line switched to the familiar cheesy accordion music typical of Italian restaurants. The abrupt shift was so jarring that I nearly dropped the phone. Within seconds, the host came back on the line, cheerful and oblivious. "Thank you for holding. So what date and time would you like your reservation?" I stammered out the details, my voice shaky, and quickly ended the call. As I hung up, I sat in stunned silence, replaying what I had just heard over and over in my mind. Over the next few days, the incident continued to haunt me. Every time I thought about the reservation, that voice echoed in my head. "You're the worst kind of cold." I tried to brush it off as a weird glitch, maybe some crossed wires, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Lisa noticed I seemed distant whenever the prom came up, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened. One night, about 3 days before the prom, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. The room was pitch dark, and the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then I heard it, the whistling. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was as if the sound had followed me from the phone call into my own home. I felt a cold dread settle over me as the memory of that voice returned, taunting me from the shadows. Determined to find some explanation, I started asking around. I spoke to people who had worked at Bellini's Bistro and even scoured local forums, looking for any stories of strange occurrences. To my surprise, I found a few threads where people mentioned hearing odd noises or voices when calling the restaurant, though most had dismissed it as a prank or a technical issue. However, one post stood out. It was from a former employee who claimed that several years ago a tragic accident occurred at Bellini's. A man had frozen to death during a freak ice storm, trapped inside the restaurant when the power went out. According to the post, the man was found clutching a phone, his fingers frostbitten and curled as if he'd been trying to dial for help. The legend goes that his spirit lingers, bitter and cold, whispering into the ears of anyone unfortunate enough to connect with him. Despite the unsettling discovery, prom night came, and I tried to put the incident behind me. Lisa and I arrived at Bellini's, all dressed up and ready for a memorable evening. But as soon as we walked in, that same icy chill from the phone call crept over me. The restaurant was crowded with other couples, laughter and chatter filling the air, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Halfway through dinner, I excused myself to use the restroom. As I walked down the dim hallway, I heard it again, the whistling. It was faint, echoing through the vents like a distant memory. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat. And then, just as before, I heard the voice, low and malicious. "You should have stayed away." The rest of the evening was a blur. I didn't tell Lisa what happened, but the tension in my chest never eased. Even now, years later, I can still hear that voice in the back of my mind whenever I think about that reservation. Every once in a while, I'll catch a faint whistle in the wind or the hiss of a radiator, and I'll be reminded of that chilling phrase, "You're the worst kind of cold." I haven't called Bellini's Bistro since, and to this day, I avoid making reservations over the phone. Some things are better left to chance, where ghosts from the past can't reach you through a line. Working at Marketplace in Glendale, California, was a mixed bag. Sometimes it was dull and repetitive, and other times chaotic with the rush of customers. I'd been working there part-time for over a year, clocking in after school to save up for college. Despite the usual routine, the job had its fair share of weird moments. Odd customers, strange noises after hours, and lights flickering at the most inconvenient times. But none of that compared to the bizarre and terrifying experience that unfolded one fall afternoon. A day that left an imprint on me and several others who were unfortunate enough to be present. It all started on an ordinary shift. I was assigned to stock and organize the freezer section, a task I usually dreaded because of how cold and isolated it felt back there. The massive metal doors always creaked ominously as you pushed them open, and once inside, the only sounds you'd hear were the hum of the freezers and the muffled chatter from the store outside. I was deep in the process of stacking boxes of frozen pizzas when I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, quick and fleeting, darting near the back door that led to the storage area. At first, I thought it was one of my coworkers playing a prank. We all knew how creepy that part of the store could get, especially when you were alone. But as I focused my attention on where the shadow had passed, something felt off. The storage area was blocked by several pallets, and there wasn't enough room for anyone to slip by without being seen. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped outside into the loading area. The cold, crisp air hit me as I scanned the surroundings, but there was nothing. No person, no movement, just the empty alley behind the store. I went back inside, but the unsettling feeling clung to me. I radioed my manager, asking if anyone else was supposed to be in the back room. The answer was a definitive no. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was probably just a trick of the light or my tired eyes playing games. As the day crept toward closing time, I was tasked with organizing the aisles. I was in the snack section, mindlessly straightening bags of chips when I saw her. Out of the corner of my eye, a woman was walking toward me from the other end of the aisle. Her movements were stiff, almost robotic, and her posture was unnervingly upright. I turned to get a better look, but just as I did, she took a sharp left and disappeared behind a shelf. My heart raced as I hurried down the aisle to see where she went, but there was no trace of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I grabbed my things, clocked out early, and practically sprinted out of the store. The next day, I returned to work, still shaken by what I'd seen. As soon as I walked in, my coworker, Sam, approached me with wide eyes. "Dude, something freaky happened last night," he said, looking pale and anxious. He told me he was upstairs in the break room by checking on the stereo system that controlled the store's music. He was adjusting the volume when he noticed something odd, a small figure sitting on top of one of the shelves. When he looked closer, he saw it was a little girl dressed in a white nightgown, staring blankly ahead with hollow eyes. She was just sitting there, like she was waiting for something, Sam said, his voice trembling. He bolted down the stairs and refused to go back up for the rest of the shift. We exchanged nervous glances. It was becoming clear that whatever was going on in Marketplace wasn't just in our heads. As the days went by, strange occurrences escalated. Lights flickered more frequently, objects would mysteriously move from one spot to another, and there was an overwhelming sense that we were being watched. Employees began reporting odd sightings. An old man who would appear in the aisles and then vanish, whispers in the back room when no one was there, and even the sound of footsteps in the upstairs storage area long after closing. One evening, after closing, the store's night crew stayed late to restock. I was helping in the produce section when the entire store was plunged into darkness. The power cut out for a moment, but when the lights flickered back on, something was wrong. The store felt colder, the air thick with tension. Suddenly, we all heard it. A low, mournful wail coming from the upstairs storage area. It echoed through the store, making our blood run cold. We gathered in the center of the store, fear etched on everyone's faces. The wailing continued, rising and falling like some sort of twisted lullaby. Sam looked at me, his face drained of color. "It's her," he whispered. "The little girl. I saw her again in the break room." None of us wanted to be the one to go upstairs and check, but the manager insisted. We slowly made our way up the narrow staircase, each step creaking under our weight. When we reached the top, the wailing stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. The break room door was slightly ajar, and through the crack we saw her, the same little girl, her back to us, sitting perfectly still on the stereo system. She turned her head slightly, just enough for us to see her eyes, empty, black voids that stared right through us. We froze in place, unable to move as a wave of icy cold air washed over us. And then, in a raspy, whispering voice, she spoke, "Get out, before it's too late." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran downstairs, grabbed our things, and left the store in a panic. The manager locked up behind us, but even he looked shaken. None of us could explain what we'd seen, and none of us wanted to talk about it afterward. Rumors spread among the staff. Some said the store was built on land that had a dark history, while others believed it was haunted by the spirit of a child who had died in a tragic accident nearby. Whatever the truth was, it became clear that Marketplace was no ordinary grocery store. After that night, several employees quit, unable to handle the fear of encountering whatever lurked within the store's walls. Those of us who stayed avoided being alone and always kept the lights on, even during the day. The haunting presence never fully left, and strange things continued to happen, but we learned to live with it, hoping that one day it would stop. To this day, I can't walk past Marketplace without feeling that chill down my spine. The store still operates, but the locals know to avoid it after dark. They say if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can still hear that mournful wail drifting from the upstairs storage area. As for me, I've moved on to a different job, far away from Glendale, but the memories of that experience still haunt me. No matter where I go, I'll never forget the eerie, cold presence that seemed to stalk us in that store. It's a reminder that some places hold more than just memories. They hold the echoes of things better left undisturbed. Echoes in the Drowned Land. When the world was brought to a standstill by the pandemic in 2020, life for me and my family was no exception. My parents were stuck in Vancouver, while I, a high school senior, was living with my grandparents in Bangladesh. They were aging and needed help with daily tasks, so I moved in to take care of them. As the virus spread and schools shut down, we decided to leave the bustling city for a safer and quieter place where my grandparents could be less exposed. Little did we know our escape from the city would take us into a nightmare we couldn't have imagined. We relocated to a remote river island deep within the Padma River. This river island, or Char as the locals called it, was so isolated that it felt like stepping back in time. The island had a boomerang shape with two distinct parts: the older, more settled northwestern side and the newer southern extension that was still largely barren. We settled in the northwest part, which had been above water for around 3 decades. The area had some scattered homes, groves of bamboo, and a small village about 3 miles away. The village was home to 50 or so people who lived in houses that would be partially submerged during monsoon season. Everyone had boats to navigate the annual floods. In contrast, The southern part of the island was relatively new, just a vast expanse of white sand, only a year or two old, with no inhabitants and no vegetation except sparse patches of grass. Our new home was an old raised tin house that had been uninhabited for years. It was built on tall stilts with a simple yet surprisingly modern layout. The house had 3 bedrooms, 2 on the southern side with a shared balcony overlooking the river, and 1 on the eastern side with a large window. I claimed the eastern room, while my grandparents took one of the southern bedrooms. The house also had a spacious dining area, a small kitchen, and a couple of bathrooms. The doors and windows were all made of steel, which felt out of place in such a rustic setting. We brought in a small generator to power the house since the island had no electricity. My grandfather had suffered a stroke 2 years earlier and needed assistance with daily activities. My grandmother had chronic leg pain, so she couldn't walk much. We hired a local woman as our housekeeper, who was only a few years older than me. She had been abandoned by her husband and needed the work. Although she was uneducated, we became friends due to our similar ages. She confided in me that strange things happened in the house, but begged me not to tell anyone. Respecting her wishes, I'll only share what I personally experienced. From the very first night, something felt off. My grandparents had gone to bed, leaving me alone in my room. The housekeeper hadn't yet moved in, so I was the only one awake. Around midnight, as I lay in bed struggling to sleep, I heard a series of strange knocking sounds coming from beneath the house. It sounded like someone was rhythmically striking the stilts with a wooden stick. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling under the new load of our belongings. But the knocking continued, precise and deliberate. Concerned that the stilts might be giving way, I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to investigate. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, the sound had stopped completely. Shining the light under the house revealed nothing but darkness and damp earth. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next day, our housekeeper arrived and things quickly escalated. The first night she spent with us, I was up late studying for my postponed exams. My grandparents were fast asleep and the house was dead quiet. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the dining area. I looked up, expecting to see the housekeeper. But what I saw froze me in place. A dark figure, towering nearly to the ceiling, stood motionless in the shadows. It was far too large to be the housekeeper, who was barely 5 feet tall and quite slim. As my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing, the figure moved, swiftly and silently, toward the barred window, knocking over a chair on its way. I snapped out of my paralysis and ran to turn on the lights, but by the time I got there, the figure was gone. The housekeeper came rushing out of her room, asking what had happened. I lied, saying I had accidentally tipped the chair, not wanting to scare her on her first night. Over the following weeks, the house seemed to come alive with malevolent energy. I would catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye. Disembodied voices whispered in an unfamiliar language outside the house, but every time I checked, there was no one there. My name was called from the darkness almost every night, but I never dared to respond. Objects would shift positions, and cold drafts would brush past me even when all the windows were shut. The generator often sputtered and died at the most inconvenient times, leaving us in total darkness. But the worst of it was reserved for our housekeeper. She became the focus of whatever was haunting the house. The voices that whispered outside began directing insults at her, taunting her about her troubled past. Her food would be swarmed by ants within minutes, despite there being no sign of insects anywhere else in the house. She often felt sharp, piercing pains in her skin, only to find her flesh hot and red, as if something had scratched her. One day, she found herself locked inside her room, even though the door had no lock on the outside. After that, she refused to stay in her room at night and would often sleep in the dining area or on the floor of my room, claiming it was the only place she felt somewhat safe. Despite the constant torment, she couldn't leave. She had nowhere else to go and seemed determined to endure whatever was targeting her. As the monsoon season arrived, the river flooded the island. The water rose to the 5th step of our staircase, leaving our house surrounded by a vast expanse of murky water. We bought a small motorboat for transportation, which I used to fetch supplies. One evening, while returning with groceries and fuel for the generator, I dropped a bag of vegetables into the river. Leaning over to retrieve it, I heard a loud splash behind me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if something unholy had climbed aboard. I didn't dare turn around. Out of the corner of my eye, I could make out a dark, humanoid shape crouched at the back of the boat, watching me. I kept my eyes forward, avoiding any direct gaze, and slowly reached for the boat's motor. The engine roared to life, but the presence didn't leave. I steered the boat toward the house, every fiber of my being screaming at me to jump into the water and swim. When I reached the stairs, I leaped out and dragged the boat up behind me. I finally looked back, and whatever had been there was gone. That night, something banged on my bedroom window, but when I checked, there was nothing outside but open water. In September, things reached a terrifying climax. One night, around midnight, I noticed the housekeeper's door was ajar. Curious, I went to check on her, only to find her room empty. The front door was wide open, and I saw a trail of flattened grass leading away from the house. I followed it in the moonlight, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail led me to the southern side of the island, where the sand dunes stretched out in eerie silence. There, I found the housekeeper, walking barefoot toward the dunes as if in a trance. I grabbed her and shook her awake. She broke down in tears, insisting she couldn't go back to the house. But in the end, she did, out of sheer necessity. That night, she slept on the floor of my room, too terrified to be alone. The next morning, she resumed her chores as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere in the house grew darker with each passing day. The voices became more venomous, the shadows more menacing. The housekeeper started taking her baths in the river and would eat her meals immediately after cooking to avoid the ants. But the haunting followed her no matter what she did. My grandmother, deeply religious, believed that her constant prayers kept the worst at bay. While my grandparents remained relatively untouched by the supernatural occurrences, the housekeeper seemed to bear the full brunt of the haunting. In April 2021, the housekeeper finally found a lead on her missing husband and left the island. After she left, the disturbances lessened significantly. The shadows still lingered at the edge of my vision, and I still heard the occasional unexplained noise, but the oppressive feeling in the house lifted. 4 months later, we moved back to the city, leaving the cursed house behind. I ran into the housekeeper in November last year. She looked tired and worn, her once lively eyes now hollow. We chatted for a while, and she told me that although the spirits hadn't followed her, her life had been spiraling downward ever since. She was unable to have children, and her financial situation was worse than ever. I gave her some money before we parted ways, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had tormented her on that island had left a permanent mark on her soul. What do you make of all this? The house had no history, and the land itself was barely a few decades old. Why would a spirit choose such a place to linger? The chill in the air that December night was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't just the cold of winter, but something deeper and more profound. My name is Rajesh, and I live in Noida, India. I'm recounting an extraordinary incident that occurred in December 2018 during my final year of undergraduate studies. After our exams concluded, my friends and I were looking forward to a 2-week break. We had our tickets ready to head home, but before leaving the hostel, we decided to take a bike ride to pass the time. Our college is situated in the Delhi NCR region, a bustling area known for its crowded streets and constant activity. On that day, we were a group of 4 friends, each sharing a bike. We set out around 6 p.m., bundled up in thick jackets to ward off the harsh cold. The warmth from our jackets, along with steaming cups of tea from a roadside stall, kept us comfortable as we explored the city. By 7:30 p.m., we decided it was time to head back to the hostel. The temperature had dropped even further, so we zipped up our jackets, pulled our winter caps down, and had another round of tea before setting off. As we made our way back, we encountered a massive traffic jam, a common nuisance in India. To avoid being late, we decided to take a shortcut. The shortcut led us to a long, straight road about 1 kilometer long, flanked by barren land on either side. This isolated stretch of road was deserted, save for us. Halfway down this desolate road, something inexplicable happened. The temperature plummeted drastically. It felt as though an icy wave had engulfed us. The drop was so severe, over 10 degrees Celsius in mere seconds, that it left us paralyzed. The cold was intense, extending over a stretch of 200 to 300 meters. Then, just as abruptly, the temperature normalized. We stopped and exchanged bewildered glances, all four of us having felt the same chilling drop. With the hostel gates closing soon, we hurried back to our dorm. The incident was unsettling, but didn't seem to warrant much concern at the time. We didn't discuss it further, preoccupied with our upcoming journeys home. Little did I know, this strange encounter was only the beginning. The following evening, after a long and exhausting journey, I finally arrived home. The familiar comfort of my house was a welcome relief after the grueling trip. My mother and I were the only ones at home. My father was away on a business trip. That night, as I was about to fall asleep, I was abruptly awoken by my mother's cries of distress from her bedroom. I rushed to her side and found her clutching her blanket tightly, her face etched with fear. She explained that she had been reading when she felt the edge of her bed creak, as if someone had climbed onto it. Initially, she dismissed it, thinking it was her imagination. But then she felt a strong pull on her blanket, as though an unseen force was trying to snatch it away. The sensation was so real that she could not ignore it. What made the situation even more unsettling was the appearance of fine sand and dust particles on one side of the bed. Our family has a strict tradition of changing clothes before touching the bed to keep it clean, so the presence of this sand was baffling. The windows were tightly shut to keep out the winter chill, and there was no construction or disturbance in the area that could explain the sand. As I examined the bed, I noticed that the sand seemed to increase, spreading more with each passing moment. We changed the bedsheet and the activity ceased. Despite our fear, we prayed and managed to sleep in the same room until my father returned. My mother, who had experienced paranormal occurrences before, suggested we accept this as part of life and not panic. She believed that the entity meant no harm. I kept this incident to myself, fearing disbelief from my hostile friends. We never spoke about the temperature drop on the deserted road, so I'm unsure if any of my friends encountered similar phenomena afterward. What links these two incidents is the sparkling yellow sand. That night at home, the sand on my bedsheet was yellow and sparkling. I recalled that the jeans I wore during the shortcut incident were also covered in the same yellow, sparkling sand. It was an eerie coincidence that connected the chilling experience on the deserted road with the unsettling events that followed at home. The weeks following the incident were filled with an unsettling sense of foreboding. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from that desolate road to my home. I became increasingly obsessed with understanding the mysterious connection between these two occurrences. I started researching local folklore and consulting with friends who had knowledge of supernatural occurrences. I discovered that certain areas in and around Noida and Delhi NCR are believed to be haunted by spirits or entities linked to unexplained phenomena. Some of these spirits are said to leave behind traces of strange substances, like yellow sand or dust, which are believed to be remnants of their presence. I learned that the road we took that night had a history of being associated with eerie occurrences. Locals spoke of sudden temperature drops and mysterious sensations reported by travelers. It seemed that the road itself might have been a gateway or a location of significant paranormal activity. There were accounts of travelers experiencing inexplicable phenomena, and some claimed to have seen apparitions or felt a strange presence while traversing that road. To further explore the connection, I visited the area with a few friends who were interested in paranormal investigations. We spent a night in the vicinity, hoping to gather any evidence or experiences that might explain the strange occurrences. We set up equipment to measure temperature changes and recorded any unusual activities. While we didn't experience anything overtly paranormal that night, the sense of unease lingered, and the yellow sand remained a haunting reminder of the unexplained events. The experience left me deeply unsettled and fascinated. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from that desolate road to my home. Whether it was a residual energy, a spirit, or simply a figment of my imagination, the connection between the chilling road and the strange occurrences at home remains a mystery. The sparkling yellow sand became a symbol of that enigma, a reminder of a night that blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural. I continue to ponder the events of that night and the peculiar coincidences that tied them together. The search for answers has become a part of my life, and I remain curious about the hidden truths that might lie behind the inexplicable phenomena I encountered. One crisp evening in late autumn, the air was still and unnervingly cold as I made my way towards the old shed on my great-grandparents' farmstead. The farm, nestled deep in the heart of the woods, had been in our family since the late 1920s. It was a sprawling property featuring a grand main house, a vast hayfield, a well-tended garden, and a serene lake, accessible by a steep, winding trail that passed by the shed. The farm held a significant place in my childhood memories, but by the time of the incident I am about to recount, it had changed dramatically. My great-grandmother had passed away in 1999, and my great-grandfather followed her in 2011. Their absence left the farm to me, now a 17-year-old with a burgeoning curiosity about the unknown. It was a year after my great-grandfather's death when the unsettling encounter occurred. At that age, I was skeptical about anything supernatural, dismissing such tales as mere folklore. Little did I know that this evening would challenge my disbelief. The shed itself was a dilapidated relic, once a tool storage area, but now more of an eyesore. Its windows were covered with old, tattered sheets that fluttered in the breeze, creating an eerie, ghostly appearance. One of the sheets had been torn and twisted into a ghastly visage that seemed to scream in silent agony. The door was always padlocked, adding to the shed's aura of mystery and making it an ever-present enigma in the landscape of our family history. It was around 6:30 p.m., with enough twilight remaining to see clearly, but with the encroaching darkness adding to the sense of foreboding. I was bored, having spent the day in aimless pursuits, and decided to take a walk down to the lake to clear my mind. As usual, my gaze fell upon the shed, its presence always managing to creep me out. I had often wondered about the stories and secrets it might hold, but I had never ventured closer. That evening, as I glanced at the shed's door, something peculiar stopped me in my tracks. The air around me seemed to grow colder, a stark contrast to the layers of coats I wore. I felt an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. My breath misted in the air as I stared at the window on the shed's door. There, framed by the torn sheet, was a face. It was not like any face I had ever seen. The features were distorted, unsettling, and haunting. The face had an unnerving feminine structure, but the eyes were the most disturbing part. Black, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me, searching my soul with an intensity that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. The bottom corner of the sheet had been ripped away, allowing the horrifying visage to be revealed more clearly. I stood frozen, a paralyzing fear gripping me. My body felt like it was encased in ice, unable to move or scream. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of the old farmstead. It was only when I heard a sharp snap of a tree branch behind me that I broke free from my trance. My instinct was to flee, and without a second thought, I sprinted towards the safety of the house, my heart pounding in my chest. Once inside, I locked all the doors and windows, refusing to step outside for the rest of the night. The warmth of the house did little to ease the cold fear that had settled in my bones. I recounted the incident to my family, but their response was dismissive. They attributed it to the darkness and my overactive teenage imagination, suggesting it was merely a trick of the light or an effect of the shadows. There had been no deaths on the property before my great-grandmother's passing, and she had not died on the farm. The locked door of the shed, however, suggested that no one could have entered to play a prank. The experience marked the beginning of my skepticism about the supernatural fading away. I began referring to the apparition as the face in the shed, a name that felt both fitting and unsettling. The months and years that followed were marked by an uneasy sense of anticipation. I never saw the face again, but the memory lingered, casting a long shadow over my perception of the old shed. My family eventually decided to sell the property, and it is now in the hands of new owners. I often wonder if they have encountered the same unsettling presence, or if the shed remains a silent witness to a haunting that refuses to let go. In an effort to understand the strange occurrence, I delved into the history of the area. Um, I learned that many old structures in the region were rumored to be haunted, with stories of apparitions and ghostly encounters dating back centuries. The old farmstead, with its long history and secluded location, was no exception. Local legends spoke of spirits lingering near abandoned buildings, and some claimed that these entities were bound to the places where they had once lived or died. My investigation led me to explore other similar accounts, and I discovered that the phenomena I experienced were not isolated. Reports of ghostly faces and eerie sightings in rural areas were not uncommon, often linked to places with a long history or tragic past. The sparkling dust and unsettling cold I had felt were consistent with other reported hauntings, where supernatural entities left behind physical evidence of their presence. Despite my efforts to uncover more about the face in the shed, I never found a definitive explanation. The experience remained a profound and haunting mystery, a reminder of the thin boundary between the known and the unknown. The old shed, with its eerie face and chilling presence, continues to be a symbol of that unsettling encounter. The new owners of the property might never know the full story, but for me, the face in the shed remains an indelible mark on my understanding of the supernatural. This is the story of an entity I've come to think of as Thatcher. The first time I encountered him, he was clad in a tweed jacket that stood out against the darkness, and it's a moment that changed me forever. Sometimes hauntings come from a location, sometimes from an object, and sometimes from a person. In this case, I believe Thatcher is tied to a location, an ominous one that lingers in my memories. Back in the mid-1980s, when I was just a child of 4 or 5 years old, my family lived in an old house on Preston Avenue in the quiet neighborhood of Winslow Park, located on the outskirts of a bustling city. Winslow Park was one of those towns with a mix of history and forgotten whispers. The street was lined with homes that ranged from early 1920s bungalows to more modern brick homes built in the 60s, much like the place we lived in, a modest 1930s style house. Preston Avenue itself was just a stone's throw away from one of the town's main roads, Hillcrest Drive, which had once been a quiet lane but had since become a central artery connecting Winslow Park to the city. Winslow Park was one of those forgotten neighborhoods, overshadowed by the city nearby. While researching it years later, I learned that it was initially founded by settlers who mimicked the colonial architecture of their European origins, and as in many parts of the country, these settlers claimed the land from the original indigenous inhabitants, erasing nearly all traces of the land's true history. But despite its dark undercurrents, the town had its charms, a mix of history, nature, and curious energy that drew in artists and dreamers alike. Our backyard was bordered by an old pasture that was home to a few horses. As a kid, I used to feed one of them through the back fence, captivated by the gentle creature. A short walk down the road led to a vine-covered laneway that seemed like it had leapt out of a fairy tale. Dense, dark, and lush, the laneway twisted its way past the remnants of an old vineyard, now overgrown with tangled greenery. That's where the eerie atmosphere of Winslow Park was most palpable. This incident I'm about to describe happened around the same time as the strange occurrences that seemed to plague that house. To this day, I'm not sure whether this memory predates or follows the other bizarre experiences. My bedroom was simple. A small bed tucked under a window with curtains that were sheer enough for streetlight to filter through. It wasn't pitch dark in my room at night. The light from a nearby street lamp cast long shadows that played across the walls. The window was on the side of the house, overlooking a narrow strip of garden where an unruly tea tree grew, its branches scratching the side fence. One night, I woke up to find a strange man perched in that tree, just outside my window. He wasn't doing anything sinister, merely sitting in the branches as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I wasn't scared, just curious. The tree was too spindly for someone to climb, yet there he was, comfortably settled among the branches. I peered at him through the edge of the curtain. He was no more than 2 feet away from me. Despite how close he was, there was a peacefulness about the encounter. His skin was pale, almost glowing in the dim light, but it was his nose that really grabbed my attention. A long, curved nose that looked like it belonged on a bird, almost like a toucan's beak. His lips were thin and wide, stretched into a faint smile. He wore a tweed jacket, old and weathered, that clashed with his unnaturally lanky frame. I can't recall much about his eyes, but I remember his hair, wild as if it hadn't been combed in years. You could say it was just a dream, but it felt too real, too vivid to dismiss. As a child, I often wandered around the house at night, an odd little habit of mine. But that night, I stayed in bed, transfixed by the sight of this strange man. We locked eyes, or at least I think we did, for what felt like hours, and then I drifted back to sleep, lulled by the odd calmness of it all. Looking back, I realized that this experience marked the beginning of an obsession I developed, an obsession with tweed fabric. Before that night, my fashion sense as a toddler was entirely centered around bright colors, glitter, and sequins. But suddenly, tweed fascinated me. I would stare at my mom's old tweed jacket or my granddad's hat, wondering how the patterns came together, what the fabric's history was, and why I felt so drawn to it. The second time I saw Thatcher was at another house in Winslow Park. My parents were going through one of their many separations, and during that time, my mom and I moved into a small flat above a bakery. The building was a narrow 3-story structure, the top floor overlooking a quiet intersection where the town's main roads crossed paths. One evening, I heard a commotion on the street below. Curious, I went to the window to see what was happening. A couple of men were arguing, likely drunk. But there, just beyond the fence in the shadow of the alley, was a faintly glowing figure. It was Thatcher, this time tinted with a dull pink hue, like a neon light dimmed by dust. He was standing there, watching the brawl with that same peculiar calm. I told my mom about the figure behind the fence, but she misunderstood, thinking I was talking about someone suspicious, and called the police. When the officers arrived, I tried to explain that it wasn't a real person, at least not in the conventional sense, but I don't think they believed a word of it. I still remember the bemused expression on the older officer's face as he patted me on the head and told me to stop worrying about ghosts. The third time was at my grandmother's house in Hollow Glen. My parents had split for good by then, and we moved in with her for a while. My grandmother was a musician, a pianist who kept a grand piano in her living room. It was during the Christmas season, and her small tinsel-covered tree sparkled in the corner. One night, in a fit of childish rebellion, I decided to sneak out of bed and play the piano in the dark, thinking it would be a delightfully gothic thing to do. As I tiptoed toward the piano, I noticed something moving outside the window. At first, I thought it was just a reflection from the tree ornaments, but then I realized it was the same pink figure from before, now shifting across the yard. I froze as Thatcher's outline came into focus. A spectral silhouette, moving with an almost leisurely pace between our yard and the neighbors. This time, he looked directly at me, and for the first time I felt fear. I dashed back to bed without ever playing a single note. The years passed, and the memory of Thatcher faded into the background. By the time I was a teenager, my curiosity had evolved into a full-blown obsession with the paranormal. I delved into all sorts of occult practices, including dabbling with Ouija boards, a decision that led to some unnerving experiences involving an entity that called itself Charlie. This spirit harassed me for months, leaving me drained and paranoid. I'll save those details for another time, but it was one of the darkest periods of my life. Once that nightmare ended, I thought I was done with strange entities. But then, Thatcher returned. I was in bed one night, having just turned out the lights, when I heard a faint thud by my door. I looked up to see a shadowy figure standing there, the same tweed coat, the same elongated nose, and wild hair. Despite the shadowy form, I could make out the details I had seen years ago. He didn't move, just stood there as if waiting for something. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, a gesture almost like a polite nod, he faded away. It was strangely comforting, reminding me of the peaceful feeling I had as a child when I first saw him. The last encounter was different because it wasn't in the waking world. It happened in a dream, a vivid, almost lucid dream that left a lasting impression. In the dream, I was working in an old haberdashery store, one that had been closed for decades. The lighting was warm, and I was behind the counter when Thatcher walked in. This time, he looked almost human. No tweed coat, just a simple black jacket. He handed me his coat and said something in a language I didn't recognize, but I somehow understood the message. You are seen. The scene shifted, and we were in a grand, decaying mansion filled with dusty furniture and hidden rooms. I found myself drawn to a piano in the corner of a dimly lit room, but before I could touch the keys, Thatcher appeared beside me, warning me not to play. We need to leave, he said, again in that strange language. The dream shifted once more. We were now standing on a dark road outside the mansion. There was a crowd, a wild, raucous party, but they didn't seem to notice us. In the distance, I saw a blinding light approaching, growing brighter with each passing moment. I understood that the light was something catastrophic, and we needed to get out before it arrived. Thatcher led me through the chaos toward a forest at the edge of the road, and as we entered the trees, I woke up. For days after that dream, I felt as if Thatcher was nearby, watching, waiting. I haven't seen him in years, but I sometimes feel like he's still out there, lingering in the shadows of forgotten places, keeping his distance, but never fully gone. Sometimes I wonder if he's tied to the history of Winslow Park, or if he's something older, something that's simply chosen to follow me. I've researched similar accounts online and in local legends, but I've never found a match. Whether he's a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely, I don't know. But one thing I do know is this: no matter where I go, I'll always feel a faint connection to Thatcher. A presence just out of reach, like a familiar figure lurking in the twilight between sleep and waking. He's out there, in the shadows, waiting, and in some strange way, I find that oddly reassuring. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.